as you can see, I've pinned the back. This is the back. Here's the center back seam. I pinned the sleeve to the back at the raglan line. Now, again, see, this is where this comes in handy. I need to know which way is facing front so that this portion of the sleeve is the back, and I can pin it then to the raglan line. What I will do off camera, I'm going to pin the other sleeve to the other side and sew both of these seams. Then we will meet at the pressing table for the next step. So here we are at the pressing table. We press everything as sewn first. And then, since this is an inside curve, we're going to be pressing the seam allowances towards the sleeve. So what we want to do is we don't want to clip into this curve here, so we're going to stretch it opposite. And what that's going to look like is so by stretching that curve this way, it's going to open up that seam allowance and it will tip over quite nicely. So let me do the other side. This is the other raglan seam. So this is just a little tip so that you don't have to clip into your seam allowance. It doesn't interrupt the seam allowance, it makes a stronger seam. Now next, I'm going to get out the sleeve board and I'm going to press the seams towards the sleeve. Now, before I press the seam allowances to the sleeve, I'm going to do a similar thing as I did at the neck earlier. I want to clip. This is at the underarm, the intersection where the raglan is going to meet the side seam. I want to press this open here and also up here. So this clip is about 1 inch down from the cut edge here. What this does is where you're going to be joining the collar and the facing, it reduces the bulk somewhat. So I'm going to press that open and then press the rest of the seam allowance towards the sleeve. So what that will look like here, just get this in range. There's that. And then bit by bit, I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the sleeve. And so here, this is where you're going to be glad you stretched this, because the seam allowance will lay flat now. And then, again, that presses open right there. So there we are. I will go off camera and press the other side and meet you back at the work table. Here I have the sleeves sewn to the back panel. Now this is where I explain what I'm thinking here. I'm planning on top stitching this by hand. That is why I sew the back to the sleeves, because really what I have found is that when hand stitching, it's easier to roll the fabric up, and so the hand stitching when you have the sleeve joined to the back. If you join the sleeves to the front, you could do the same thing. But I find that it's easier joining the sleeves to the back, because once you have the front on, you can roll the fronts to the sleeves, but you can't roll the fronts to the sleeves to the back. It just makes hand stitching this seam allowance, or this seam, easier. So now I will go off camera and sew the same chain stitch with the ribbon floss to both of these seam allowances, and once I'm finished, I'll bring you back the results. So here we have the raglan seam with the ribbon floss chain stitch as the top stitch. Now you notice here at the underarm, I've stopped it about an inch below the seam allowance here. And as I have done on the other rows of the chain stitching, I've stopped it, about 3/4 of an inch from the cut edge, so that you don't have to worry about catching that into the seam or inadvertently clipping it when you install the collar. So the sleeves are sewn to the back. Now I will go off camera and sew the fronts to the sleeves and sew the chain stitch and bring you back the result. So here I am, back from sewing the sleeves onto the fronts and sewing the top stitching. So it's starting to look like a coat. But one thing, before we sew the underarm and the side seam, we want to place the cuff latch. Now the cuff latch, there's a placement mark on the pattern. So what I do, I like to just mark it on the garment. So this is the lower mark on the pattern, and it is, if you need a number, 3.5 inches from the cut edge. And you can see here, what I've done is I've basted the cuff latch to the sleeve, pointing opposite. So that is what I will do over here. So here is the other cuff latch on the other sleeve, because once we have this positioned, we can then sew the underarm seam and the side seam. So let me just place that right there. And you try to make it parallel to the cut edge. It's not going to really matter because it's just going to catch into the seam here. This is just to keep the thing from flapping around like a screen door. So really, I'm just going to sew a tailor baste. And this will hold everything together while I'm working. And there we are. So I can trim that thread. So here we are. The cuff latch is now secure. So really the next step I'm going to do off camera, because there's no mystery to it. We really turn these inside out, pin from the cuff to the underarm and then down, and sew in one long seam. I will bring back the results. And here we have the main body of the coat sewn together. And you can see there's the cuff latch. It actually catches in the underarm seam. Ultimately, where this will go is this will fasten back with a button here. So there we have the underarm seams sewn. So since it's starting to look like a coat, the next thing the coat needs is the collar. That will be the next step. Now that we have the body sewn together, it's now time to put on the collar. So as you can see here, we have the collar already constructed. So we have a lot of work to do. Let's proceed. To begin, I've sewn 3/8 of an inch from the cut edge, because this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, all around the neck edge. All the way around. So you can see it catches the stay tape. I've narrowed down the seam allowances at the shoulders before I sewed to reduce some of that bulk. So we have the stay stitch of the neck so it doesn't stretch. Next, I'm going to be clipping before I start installing the collar. So really what you want to do is you just want to clip to the stay stitching. And these clips are, about 1/4 of an inch or so apart. And you work all the way around. Here's the center back. And heading over to the front panel. So here we are. We have all of our seam allowances clipped. From here, I'll bring in the collar and we'll start pinning the collar to the body. Here is center back seam right here. And so how I visualize this, I have to get oriented. So let's see. There, that is the center back seam on the collar. And again, have to get oriented here. There we are. There is the center back seam on the body. No, actually it's right there. So now it's going to look a little wonky because we have top stitched over here, but there is the actual center back seam on the body itself. So now, see, ultimately, you want these two to match, and so you put the under collar, right side, to the right side on the body. Now I'm going to, foolishly, I put these pins in upside down. So these two will match. And so you pin them one on top of the other. Like so. From here, you work out one side. And notice I'm pinning perpendicular here. This is because I'm going to thread base this. So I don't have to worry about any pulling out of pins when I go to the machine, because there will be no pins as I go to the machine. So I find it's easier to find the dead center back and work my way out from the center outward. So what I will do is continue pinning this and go off camera and pin the other side, and I will bring you back the results. See you in a few moments. Almost done. Okay, so now that we have it pinned, because like I said, we started in the center back and we worked this way, you want to check it to make sure the collar is on completely centered. And this is how I do it. What I'll do is I'll come here and I'll match these two edges and see if the edges of the collar land at the same place, because you want the distance from the end of the collar to the corner to be consistent on both sides. And you know, if you check, yes, they both hit. So that means this collar is placed properly. So from here, what I'm going to do here is to thread baste. Now this is one of those times when I will thread baste here with what's in the machine. I will thread baste on top of the stay stitching. So this is all going to be about 1/8 of an inch inside the seam line. So it will be all okay. And using the same color as what you have in the machine means that if you really don't want to rip it out, you can sort of not rip it out. I know I'm speaking heresy here, but okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to make you watch me sew this whole thing. I'm going to go off camera and sew the rest, and I'll meet you back here. Almost finished. Okay, so I will secure the thread. Here we are. So everything is basted on, and one more check. I just like to make completely sure that these are even. So what I'm doing here is I'm matching the two ends of the body, and I just want to make sure that both ends of the collar are at the same point, and they are. So now I'm going to run over to the machine, and when I sew, I'm going to sew with the stay tape up, and I'm going to sew again right on that stay stitch. I'm not going to sew the final seam yet. I'm going to be sewing at 3/8 of an inch, and that will solidify the collar. So I will bring it back when I'm done. And here the collar is set on. Next step, before the facing, we're going to be addressing the hem. But at this point, let's just enjoy the work that we've done.